Hi, this is Mary Jo Watts. This is the second video in a series in which I look at the introductions to various Sherlock episodes using visualizations created in ImageJ. Today's episode is about the blind banker. What you're looking at here is a montage view of the blind banker's introduction, and you'll notice it's all the screen caps for all the shots laid out in a nice grid format here. What it tells me is pretty straightforward. We've got a difference in coloring here in the middle bands. It gets darker right before the titles and the mystery begin to heighten. And here we've got some gray space with a different framing of a face that looks a little bit unique. We've got some close-ups in on one of the characters in the introduction and some light, bright in the background. So we do notice that there are contrasts between the atmosphere that the female lead character is photographed in versus what we will eventually see as a male character that's introduced into the scene, and then the very darkness again that starts before the mystery really begins to unfold. This is a great view, really helpful, gives you a sense of how many shots are in the scene and the coloring, the lighting, but what it's missing is the dynamics of the scene. What it's missing, again, that I'm really interested in is camera movement. Really believe that camera movement helps tell the story in a way that's almost imperceptible to most viewers, and hopefully this series will make you think a little bit more about what the camera is telling us. In the previous video, I talked about the importance of understanding visually what you're looking at. What I've done in the next shot is I've taken all of the pages, think of the screen caps as pages of a book, and I've laid each one of them one after the other so that they form a book. And then I've turned them to the foredge, like Abraham Lincoln here. It tells a story. Each one of those colors on the side of each one of those individual pages or each one of those individual screenshots laid against each other, flipped to the side, tells a story. And it looks like a melted mirror in some cases. The blind banker has a much longer introduction than the Great Game, so you'll see many more striations. You'll see they're wider because there are more screen caps involved, and you'll see, if you've looked at the previous video, some differences here. You'll see a lot more camera movement, a lot more action within the frame of the purview of the frame of the camera, with some stillness. So it's a different director for this episode, same director of photography, but a different director. So you can begin to see a little bit of a difference between the styles and the visuals, and it's a different writer. The Great Game was written by Mark Gatiss. This is written by Stephen Thompson. The Great Game was directed by Paul McGuigan. This was directed by Eros Lin, and again the same director of photography and Steve Laws. So what you see here are some fairly steady bands, but you've got a reversal, the same kind of coloring in reverse. So what's going to happen there? Here we have a long stretch of gray that has a bit of white light coming into it. Some movement here because there's no solidity in that striation, so you know that there's something's moving, either the camera or the person in front of the camera, and it looks to me like it's going to be the camera. We'll check it out. Again, this is mostly solid, lines, but there's some jaggedness here, which again indicates movement, as does the jaggedness here. And you'll see that we've got kind of a solid band, but a little bit of dotting in there that again indicates movement. It's a little bit clearer in another view, the top view of the book. So I'll show you that in a moment. Here you've obviously got the female lead. Her dress is moving, so there's quite a bit of action happening here. Again, it's solid and some action towards the end. And it goes from light and subdued tans into more foreboding grays and blues. This is another view of the same scene. It's the top view looking down, and it really obviously shows the amount of movement in the scene. Each one of these shots almost is dynamic. This one is the most static of them, so there's a lot less camera movement. This looks like we've got a steady camera with movement of the actor inside the shot. And then this is just a free-for-all. The camera appears to be moving, the subject appears to be moving. We'll check that out in a moment. Same here. This one's interesting because it's on an angle. It's consistent. We still have visible bands, but they're not vertical, they're on an angle. So let's take a look and see what's going on there. Here we are with the video of the blind banker. Think of this as the book with all the pages behind it. And we're going to take those pages and run them like a film. And we'll see what we've got. Some dynamism at the beginning here we're expecting to see. Aha, so the very beginning shot has a little bit of movement in on the female character's hand. Watch the movement. She comes out of her finger and her hands go out of frame. And when we take another look at the striation, you're going to see something very interesting is happening. There's a visual kind of movement that doesn't involve the camera itself moving, but involves the lenses of the camera moving. It's called a focus pull, and it's done by a crew member called the focus puller in conjunction with a camera operator. And watch what happens to the teapot. It's a little out of focus, but as I scrub, it goes way out of focus, and then the focus goes to this female hand at the teapot. And then we've got another shot with these blurred lights, which are called bokeh. They add some visual interest to the scene. And notice that the camera is bobbing up and down slowly. So her hand's coming in and out of the frame to a greater and lesser degree. The bokeh is moving in the background, so you're getting some shifts here. Then we cut immediately to another scene where the weighting is on the left with the teapots and the spouts. And we've got some visual interest here in the grays and the bokeh. And then we switch scenes. So let's just take a quick look at what that looks like in a larger view. So we've gone through the hand moving in and out of the teapot, and we've gone through a little bit of the bokeh movement here, and you see that the camera is bobbing ever so slightly with the hand. You'll see that the lighting is pretty consistent, but there is a little bit of movement, and that's that smooth movement of the camera, just sort of bobbing up and down. So we don't have a lot of obvious movement. It's very gentle movement, so it's kind of consistent but a little swingy here. And again, we've got a very dynamic kind of camera. To have a camera this close up and still would be slightly boring. It would give maybe an uneasy sense to the viewer. This camera is almost always in motion. And now we get a lot of blurriness. You'll see here that, I'm going to expand it. You'll see here that we are in this section, and it's going to be a short shot, and as we move through it, it's going to look a little bit distinct because it is moving. One of the things to notice along with the dynamism of the camera, that it's moving and bobbing around, is the focus. The focus comes in and out of the scene, and it sort of moves in conjunction, almost musically, with the movement of the camera. It's very difficult to keep objects sharp as the camera moves in this closeness, but it gives a little bit of an interesting view. We still have the baka in the background, nothing's really in focus, and as you watch the shots, things come in and out of focus in the scene. It's quite a choreography. And then we move into that gray area that we were looking at before. You can see that this is a frame with an out of focus background. It's putting the young girl on the left side of the frame. It's following the rule of thirds, and it's a very classic frame, very straightforward. You'll see that there's a lot of jaggedness while the color stays the same here because it's in the same scene, but we've got the teapot lifting, so we get that wavy format here. And again, the camera is sort of moving. It's very dynamic. It's handheld, and it's coming in at the female character at an angle. And you can see here that there's less consistency in the coloring, so the background is also changing. And here we have a wide shot with most of the action going on within the frame. The camera is not moving in the same dynamic way. You'll see I've just let it run for a few seconds and nothing has changed. So the camera is in a locked position, so it's called a locked shot, and it's probably on sticks, looking straight in at the action, letting that action unfold. And then we go directly from that wide shot into a very tight close-up of the female character, who again is framed in the rule of thirds. You'll see that the screen is sort of divided here in, mathematically obvious way, and she's weighted to the left, to the right rather, while what's at the left is out of focus to bring attention into her face. Now, as she begins to move her head, the camera moves with her, and that's a bit of intuitive camera work. To be that tight up on someone's face in a close-up, as they move, you're going to lose either the tip of their head or their chin out of frame, and the camera is working to keep that individual in the frame. But it's a bit of a dance again. So now we've gone from the camera moving and bobbing. You'll see here we had that sort of movement, the jagged movement, into a scene where the actual setting is static because you see these lines. And again, we're going to get some movement in on the female figure and some movement in from this darker character. So we're expecting to have a static scene with movement from the actors within. You'll see that this jagged movement is created simply by her arms. And as he comes forward, you'll see his sweater. So the neat part about this is that you can see that she's moving kind of on a diagonal and he's coming straight towards the camera. And then here we get this really interesting wave of movement. I can't wait to see what happens here. So again, we have the female character framed to the right. They've got a lot of open space. Let's see what happens, where these waves come from. So we're going back and forth between shorter shots and getting response shots from the male character. Again, you'll see there's a focus pull. We've gone from him being in focus to the focus being pulled onto the female character, and that's really, again, important. It's movement without the camera movement. You'll see the camera is moving back and forth ever so slightly, causing this a little bit of stability but some movement, and you've got the focus going back and forth. It's really a great way to tell a story that's also economical in terms of shooting, because you don't have to have two lighting setups. You don't have to move the camera about. You can have one camera. You don't necessarily have to go back and forth between an A camera and B camera that is focusing in on the close-up. Really, the scene is playing out in front of you with the focus telling the story and guiding your eye. But watch the movement of the camera. So you see in the windows that the camera operator is moving along with the female character. So while the focus puller is making sure that she's in focus while she's speaking, he's moving to keep her in the frame, but able to have a little bit of drama by having her face tied up in the camera. To the back, you see you've got this lighting. It's interesting. It appears here, but it's not in focus. It sort of just divides the frame up into thirds, and then again. So it's a very nice mathematical bit of framing. And she brings the teapot in. So we see the darker coming in with her hair and the teapot. But again, the setting is the same. We've got this distance between them, and it rocks a little bit as the camera moves. Now we've got a bit of a different movement. We're moving around the female character so that we can have a close-up but a wider view of the scene. So the camera is no longer just sort of directly on her and bobbing with her. Now we're moving around in sort of a circular way. You'll see again we're moving towards the right. We're sort of sliding over. So you're getting a bit of a different view. So the camera can stay still and bob up and down to the top and the bottom, to the right and the left. It can be on a track and curve around, or it can be the camera operator holding the camera on his shoulder and moving around. In this case, we have a bit of a different motion. It's sort of rocking around them in a circular way and to the right and the left. So the camera can move in many, many different ways. In this scene, you're seeing a lot of different kinds of movement. And you'll see that center bit here is very standard, while we get a little bit more movement here. Now, a very close-up analysis of these striations could probably tell you what kinds of movement the camera is actually making. But in this case, just very generally, it tells you the camera is in a dynamic position, and if you want to see how the dynamism is played out in the shots, this is where you go to look. Again, we've got that bobbing and weaving happening. We've got the focus where he's out of focus, she's in focus. So the focus puller is trying to keep her in focus, while the cameraman is trying to keep her face tied up and in frame. And then we move to another shot. You'll see here that it's very dynamic. It's a completely different scene. The coloring is entirely different, and it's very jagged. So let's take a scrub back and take a look at what's in focus, what isn't in focus, and how is the camera moving around it. So you do have the movement of the camera that kind of mirrors her hand. What's in focus is over here on the side. We've got some light like shining down on the box to give it a little bit of a ping. Let's see how the movement goes. A very quick shot. You'll see it's very thin because it's a very short shot, but a key one because she's shutting the box. Enough. The conversation's done. Then we have this very low angle still camera on these doors to maximize the weight and the heft of the doors shutting. That's also a beautiful shot because they've got this gorgeous patterns on the door. But the low angle is very foreboding. It makes the door look even more intense and heavy than it probably even actually is in real life. And again, another low angle. Very quick shots. And here we have sort of flags on the side of the shot and lighting coming down on the balls of the lamps. And now we have a crossfade. So you're moving one scene over the other, and you're fading one view out in favor of another. So it's fading out and fading in and moving at the same time. So this is a situation where the editing comes in and is dynamic like the camera. The camera was still on these globes and still on these objects, and the editing is now doing the movement. The editing is doing the focus. The editing is changing up the dynamism. And the camera is sort of coming in on a little wobbly. And you can tell, again, if you take a very careful look at this striation that we've just come through, that there is consistency, but then these little dots indicate that the camera is on a dolly or it's panning around, where we've got some consistency in the set, but we're introducing something new into it. And if you can see this shot and compare it to a couple of other shots in which we've got the camera moving into a scene, you'll begin to see patterns and be able to tell that this is the kind of shot that's happening in that striation. So the camera is moving around. You'll see that she's becoming center in the frame. There's this nice parallelism. But again, it's kind of always moving, and that is a signature of the cameraman, the DOP Steve Laws, the always kind of moving, always dynamic camera. You don't notice it until you notice it. Now notice that once the camera's arrived, it's static on her for a little while in the center, but it's always just ever so slightly moving, so you're going to get waves that you don't get when the camera is on sticks and completely static. And again, we have an interesting bit of framing. We've got some out of focus bits here. The angles here are well lit, so you can see this, and there's something going on in the back. It's like we have to squint a little bit. So it's getting darker. You'll notice it went from light of day, so we can imagine that conversation was a bit lighter, and we progress into the darkness, into the out of focus, into the depth. We're being drawn in from the viewpoint of the camera into a far deeper field, and it'll take us a bit to understand what's going on there. She's got some distress going on, so we're going back and forth between the tans, but it's definitely darker. The coloring is darker. She's obviously distressed. And again, you'll see here in the camera movement, there's some steadiness and consistency of the set in the coloring, but there is movement going on. Sometimes it's the camera bobbing, and sometimes it's the actor bobbing or moving around in the frame. And as she comes toward us, the scene is lit so that she will turn into silhouette, which is very nice with this symmetry here. But it also obviously displays that she's going into the darkness. A little bit of light to reveal before we change this shot. And now we're in a completely different kind of shot. Great in terms of framing. It's very symmetrical. You get the focus here, and it goes out of focus. It just draws your eye. And she turns around. She's looking down this direction, then she turns around to see this ghostly item. So we've got that horizontal ness that's appearing here. You'll see that setting, those striations are on a diagonal, so we're moving back and forth between a view that is pretty static. There is some movement. It's pretty static, but that symmetry, that angle gives it a sense of, I want to say, movement as well. It gives it a sense of progression of looking towards a space, but she's looking away from the obvious. Your eye immediately goes this direction, but she's looking in the other direction. And you'll see here again, these are at a stripe because we're at a horizontal, and she's moving about in the frame. That's where the darkness moves. And then back into this odd view, and then we realize as she's moving that this is the other direction. This was the way that she was looking towards the lockers, but she's headed the other direction into the deeper part of the frame. And then back to this ghostly part. And notice that the camera is wobbling, it's moving a little bit, making it a little bit more dynamic. So you have the movement of the cloth along with the movement of the camera. And she's not entirely smooth. It's not an entirely smooth movement on her part. And we're moving in towards the last bit of the scene, the last shot. So that's what you can see in these scenes. You see a consistency of setting with movement within. Sometimes that movement appears jagged because of the camera. Sometimes it appears jagged, as in this case, because the camera itself is static, but there's movement of the characters within the frame. And especially in these kinds of images where we've got some static movement and then these bits of these dots, they indicate pretty clearly when you get accustomed to it that we've got the camera moving probably on a dolly or perhaps on a steady cam where the scene itself stays static, but the movement is either of the camera around the set, around the scene, or around an individual in the scene. So here we've talked about focus pulling, the ever-moving camera, and a little bit about light and coloring to set up a bit of foreboding. So those are some of the things that you can notice in the blind banker by taking a look at these YZ axis and XZ axis views. Thanks for watching.